Hello, my name is Pimentel. Today I'm going to be reviewing Raquel Willis's The Risk It Takes to Bloom. This book really stood out to me in a lot of ways. I've read a few memoirs, but this was the first about someone who wasn't white. I found I could relate a lot more to this character, and it let me unpack a lot of things about being trans and race that I hadn't looked at before. The story follows Raquel Willis, a journalist, activist, and an inspiration, I would add. It chronicles her story from childhood through school, high school, college, onto her career in media, journalism, and then on to working at nonprofits and being a voice for all trans people. But especially, she talks about Black trans people. I want to share some quotes, some lessons, some things I learned from Raquel's work. Here's the first quote. During the summer, we darted all over our lush green neighborhood. I loved our breaks between adventures, especially when I could inhale the magnolia blooms that reached over the fence, separating my family's backyard from our neighbors. Of course, I'd never say that. I was already aware that flowers were forbidden, like Barbies and the color pink. Being rough and tumble, having chlorophyll-stained shorts, and taking outside odors was how I was supposed to bond with the other boys. This quote brings in the theme of the story, the structure of the book, which has chapters of seedling all the way to garden, and all the steps between blooming and growing. The author, Raquel, uses it as a metaphor for her own life. I appreciated this quote as the flower kind of transcends the feminine meaning we often put, and it takes on the structure of the book, but also a commentary on just that. On gender, even children, even myself being young, could understand that there were certain rules that were meant to be followed that couldn't be broken about where my place was as a boy. Don't cry, man up, you have to take care of a family someday. There was an expectation of roughness and not showing emotion, even though it was subtle. Sometimes we don't realize how much gender is a part of our culture from even at a very young age. So I could relate to this kind of distance from pink, from flowers. And I think it's beautiful how as Raquel grows, comes out, as she comes into her own, she becomes a flower that blooms. I think that's really beautiful and inspiring. Let's keep going. Coming out is really hard, and realizing who you are is a really, really beautiful thing. So I wanted to share just a few chapters ahead when Raquel's in college dating a trans boy, which again I could relate to. She's folding laundry while on FaceTime with her boyfriend. At the time, just for context, Raquel had been doing a lot of drag. One night, Alessio and I video chatted while I straightened up my ever-cluttered room. As I chipped away at the mountain of fresh laundry, Alessio and I talked more about gender transitions and his plans to start hormones. Then my life changed forever. You know, if I could just be a woman all the time in my everyday life, I would, I said, absent-mindedly, as I placed some jeans in the dresser. I texted those words to Alessio before, but saying them out loud felt heavier. My body stiffened. Wait, I stuttered, looking at Alessio's expectant smirk. I think I'm a woman. I am a woman. I repeated as tears of joyful revelation slowly streamed down my face. You are, he said back. I am, I repeated, looking around my room as if I was in a new world. Wow. I wish you were here right now, I said, looking back at him. I wish I was too, he said. I should be. I never appreciated him more than in that moment. Aiding in my epiphany, it was affirming to have a trans boyfriend in the early era of my gender transition. He sweetly asked if he should call me his girlfriend from now on, and I told him we'd try out and see if it felt right. And it did. He became even more of a haven for me. Our relationship showed me that desire and love could still be possible as I inched closer to Black trans womanhood. Coming out is hard. Having loved ones around you that accept you is no guarantee. I could relate a lot to this. I also have a trans boyfriend, and on our first date, almost 2 years ago now, I talked about my struggles with gender. And since then, we have bloomed into the people we always were on the inside. And it was just really relatable. This whole college group, young adults, who were all finding their gender together. I felt like my story was reflected in the pages, and it was really inspiring. Next quote. Coming out to a boyfriend, to other queer people, to trans people, to non-binary people is a whole lot easier than coming out to your parents. So, on a weekend visit, I told my mother I had reached a conclusion about my gender after months of therapy. after months of therapy. She seemed to anticipate my revelation. "You've lived all your life trying to live up to other people's ideas of who you should be. It's time you live life for you," she said. That encouragement soothed me. I assured her I'd let her know when I was ready to start HRT and that I'd figure out how to tell my siblings. Telling my parents was easier than I thought. I think it's easier for parents when you come out at first, and I was like Raquel and I didn't want to start hormones immediately. I think it seemed a little less real when all of this stuff was just changing my clothes and changing my identity inside, but wasn't taking any medication. When I told my mom I was on HRT, that conversation was a lot harder. Even telling her I was bi, I told her in the car, somehow as if the distraction of driving would lessen the fact. In the case of telling HRT, I think it was harder. She was upset and said I should have consulted her, and it was a big deal, and I had already started, so it was I guess a little too late. I hope that eventually my relationship blooms into something like this, where Raquel's mom anticipated her words and was really encouraging. My family is very accepting, and I know I'm really, really lucky. But I also recognize that at the same time, this family that loves me sometimes misgenders me, and I feel a lot more alien to them and not just like a daughter. So I hope my relationship blooms, and I think this beautiful relationship Raquel has with her mother is a good example for other parents of trans children, and was a moment that felt good in the story. So this first part of the book was really inspiring, just seeing Raquel, in my mind's eye, seeing Raquel live her life through all these different stages. The rest of the book covered more of her work with nonprofits and activism. This really inspired me too. I was encouraged and am encouraged to do more for my community. Being someone privileged who lives in California, I don't receive the brunt of all this legislative, cultural, and just inhumane attack on the trans community. I want to share a little bit from one of her speeches, the final speech, the one that gave me chills. And I don't want to read it word for word because they're not my words and it's not my experience. But the message she gave and this book gave as far as the activism portion of being a trans person, which of course I see now is really important, that as much as it's important to find ourselves, to bloom, to grow, and I see myself as very early in my trans experience, which doesn't have an ending until maybe when I'm really old. I see a big part of this as speaking out for my community. She reminds me to look to my ancestors, to look to those who came before me. The person that I resonate with the most and I want to look into more is Silvia Rivera, Cubana, Venezolana, trans activist from New York. And in her final speech, the one that gave me chills, the one that inspires me, the one that motivates me to keep going when things get hard, is she talked about Black trans power. And I would add Latin American trans power, brown trans power. Oftentimes in the news, we hear of our strife, we hear of our deaths. I see the news and I'm powerless to change legislation in other states. But I think it was really important for her to remind us of the power we have in being ourselves. She showed me the power I have in just living her life. It inspires me to live mine. I believe in Latin American trans power, and brown trans power, and Black trans power. I'm a woman and I am powerful. There's a quote in the book that she says, "White queer people can worry about legislation," and sometimes I find myself worrying about it. But she goes on to say that Black trans people, and I include Black and brown, are worried about staying alive. And it was a good reminder that that's a step to take before we worry about legislation. And though things are getting harder, being a part of the solution of keeping our trans brothers and sisters alive, our trans siblings alive, our non-binary siblings alive is more important, of course. I hope you feel my happiness. I hope you feel my inspiration. I like turning the sadness of the reality of being trans in the US into something more powerful. People often in the media and even just in conversation think of trans people as this new thing, this new weird group of people that came out of nowhere and are demanding rights and pushing their way of life on other people. There was another speech in the book that spoke of trans women in the same breath as disabled women, as Black women, as Latin women, as Muslim women. The story of trans women, and I'll speak for trans women because that's what I am. I don't really know how to speak for that which I am not, but I'm a trans woman, so I will speak for trans women. and say that our struggle isn't new. This isn't something that just came up. We've always been here. And in many ways, our fight is a continuation of a fight for gender equality. You know, first white women got rights to a certain extent, and black women are left behind. And lately I feel like Muslim women have been left behind, queer women have been left behind, and now it's trans women. And the fight for trans feminine, trans women's rights is the fight for all women's rights. The fight for trans people rights is the fight for everyone's rights, because when you respect everyone, you can let them be who they are. I'm a woman and I believe in my power. This story reminded me of that. This story showed me that you can be a professional, you can be beautiful, you can be yourself, and you can also be an activist for your people. I don't know if I'm ready to go work in a nonprofit, and I'm certainly not the person to have the podium at a rally yet. I'm still finding my footing, but this story inspired me going to be stronger, to embrace my power, and to live without fear. I hope you read this book, whether you're trans or not, and you also find your power to protect those trans people who, as she shares, are often sidetracked. If you look like me, if you talk like me, be that in English or en español, si te pareces a mí, si eres una mujer trans latina, if you're a trans woman, quiero que recuerdes tu poder. I want you to remember your power, and I hope you're inspired to live your life to its fullest, because that in itself is a revolution, and that's what matters. Living. Once we're all living, we stop being killed, then we can worry about everything else. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.